shortly receive a notification from requesting or seeking your permission for that purpose. Welcome to the Helsis Global South Encounters with me, Franklin Obiodum, currently Professor of Global Development Studies at the University of Helsinki as the chair. If you would like to stay connected between the encounters, I'd like to draw your attention to our new Twitter account, LinkedIn account, and Just Ecological Political Economy, the Helsis Global South blog, links to which you can see in the chat box. Great power competition dominates the news these days. It is not only military might, but also technological prowess and information war that mark our age of sustainability and the march for green energy. Both academia and the media seem to be grappling not with whether to worry about these trends, but how to avoid the great illusion and to worry wisely. Our guest today, Professor Michael Klare, is renowned as an analyst of these tensions. A world-leading scholar on military strategy, the politics of resources and peace, Professor Klare's work has been published or presented in the leading journals in these fields, in major books, in the press, and even in movie and moving documentaries. These works have been widely reviewed in both military journals and civilian outlets by intelligence officers, security experts, the lay, and the learned. For the most part, these views and reviews have been positive. According to one reviewer, Brigadier General Chris Kane, Dean Emeritus of the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College, Klare's work is, quote, not written as scientific analysis to impress scientists, unquote. Rather, as Brigadier Kane notes, Klare always has an eye on urgent questions of reality and security, but also sustainability. Professor Klare's work has been praised as providing either a corrective, sequel, or augment to the poesis and treatises of the famous and mighty Samuel Huntington, Robert Kaplan, Francis Fukuyama, and many more. But he is also criticized as contradictory, controversial, and contrarian. For more than 3 decades at Hampshire College in the US, Klare was professor and teacher of peace, but most of his research focused on war, with titles of his books ranging from American Arms Supermarket and Low-Intensity Warfare to Rogue States and Nuclear Outlaws and Light Weapons and Civil Conflict. A critic of the establishment, a senior visiting fellow of the Arms Control Association Board of Directors, and a correspondent for The Nation, the progressive newspaper founded by abolitionists in 1865, he is also renowned to have condemned the Pentagon with books such as Resource Wars, Blood and Oil, and The Race for What's Left. But as recently as 2019, he seemed to switch from condemnation to commendation with his book, The Pentagon's Perspective on Climate Change, which praises the Pentagon's commitment to and action on climate science. At a time of great power competition and cumulative crisis, most analysts and activists see hope in green energy, green technology, and AI more broadly. But Michael Klare sees harm. Is Professor Klare simply being contrarian, contradictory, or controversial? Or is it the phenomena he analyzes that are contradictory, contrarian, and controversial? Is AI a security blessing, or could it contribute to peace and sustainability? Is a commitment to green energy transition a conduit for conflict or a cornerstone of security? Is war peace, or is green peace war? To address these questions, Professor Michael Klare joins us on Zoom from New York City in the United States. Welcome, Professor Klare. The microphone is yours.
Oh, okay. I hope you could hear me well. Thank you,
Yes.
Franklin, for that very eloquent introduction. It says more about me than I thought I knew. So thank you very much. I'm speaking to you today, everyone, from actually not from New York City, but from my home in Northampton, Massachusetts, in Western Massachusetts. And I send you greetings, everyone who's listening. And in response to what Franklin said about my views being contrarian and the like, I'd like to say that that's a product of exploring the real world and the changes that we see in the real world and how that affects social societies and social relations. So today in my presentation, I'm going to explore the evolution of the competition for vital resources, looking first at the period between 2000 and 2010, and then the present, and consider what lessons we might draw from that evolution over that period. I'll start by going back to the year around 2000 when I first started investigating this issue. At that time, the prevailing view among both analysts in the field and government policymakers was that global supplies of vital resources, especially energy and especially oil, were being depleted at an alarming rate and would soon start to contract, producing intense competition and conflict over the remaining supplies. You could call this assumption PIGRS, or PIGRS, meaning presumed imminent global resource scarcity. The PIGRS paradigm largely defined thinking about resources in the first decade of this century. It assumes that supplies of most vital industrial materials existed in non-renewable reservoirs that were rapidly being depleted, leading to severe scarcities, resulting in international tension and conflict. This was often discussed in terms of an imminent peak in daily production rates, followed by an inevitable decline. The peak notion was spurred in part by renewed interest in the work of M. King Hubbert, the American geologist who in 1956 predicted that domestic US oil production in the lower 48 states would peak in 1972, which it did. His prediction was accurate, leading many people to think that he was a prophet of oil decline. Of course, he didn't include Alaska and offshore drilling. So in the end, it turns out that we have to rethink Hubbert's peak. But at the time, his thinking had immense influence. In 2001, Kenneth DeFays another geologist, published the book Hubbert's Peak, The Impending World Oil Shortage. He used Hubbert's calculations to predict that global oil production would peak in 2015, somewhere below 100 million barrels per day, and then decline, spurring intense competition and conflict over what remained of oil, and requiring enormous activity to avert industrial collapse. The notion of peak oil was spurred, also spurred similar analyses of other vital resources, including natural gas, uranium, copper, cobalt, and fresh water. And in almost every case, the answer came back the same. We faced an imminent peak of production. Now, this was all in terms of using available means of extraction. But the assumption in that period was that peaking was inevitable and would lead to conflict over diminished supplies. So a world of violence over resources was the expectation. And to avoid that required emergency action to reduce consumption and to find alternatives. This outlook, the Piggers outlook, was widely addressed by civil society. For example, by the Association for the Study of Peak Oil. I don't know if any of you listening are familiar with that organization, but ASPO, but it once had chapters throughout Europe and meetings that were widely attended. I participated in many of those meetings, including in Europe, where people discussed the imminent decline in oil production and its inevitable geopolitical consequences. This outlook also had a huge impact on government policy at the time. This was during the Bush administration in the US. And it was encapsulated in the concept of energy security, a concept that hadn't prevailed before in US security thinking, but became equated with national security, that the protection, acquisition of necessary oil supplies was a critical component of national security. Energy security doctrine dictated that states take steps to enhance their access to adequate supplies of energy, even in the face of foreign threats to essential imports, through such measures as increasing domestic production of oil and natural gas by any means necessary, for example, by drilling in marginal or protected areas, wilderness areas, like the Alaska Wilderness Preserve in the United States. Secondly, by investing in technology to exploit hitherto inaccessible reserves, for example, deep offshore and in the Arctic. And most importantly, shale formations that previously had been considered inaccessible, but with new technology began to yield large supplies of oil and natural gas. Third, energy security called for investing in renewable supplies of so-called renewable sources of energy, such as wind and solar and ethanol, corn-based fuel. Fourth, it called for the diversification of supplies away from the Middle East. The Middle East was seen as a major supplier of oil and gas, but was considered dangerous. So the idea was to diversify away from the Middle East to such areas as Africa and Russia. So a lot of effort went into increasing Western dependence on Russian oil. And we know the consequence of that. In Africa, it led to increased military involvement through the establishment of the Africa Command, AFRICOM, and also to a huge increase in Chinese involvement in Africa, which persists to today. Now China relies on Africa for a large share of its energy. Also, it's led to growing interest in the Arctic as a source of energy. And finally, energy security led to increased military involvement in all of these areas. These policies generated a lot of opposition and resistance, but did result in the introduction of technologies allowing the extraction of oil and gas from previously inaccessible areas like the Arctic, deep offshore, and shale formations. So the sense of imminent decline began to disappear. And we no longer face a imminent disappearance of oil, and peaking of oil seems now increasingly distant into the future. We've passed 2015 and oil production continues to grow. So one consequence of all of this is the notion of scarcity has diminished as the primary driver of resource competition and conflict. But in the interim, two other factors have entered the equation, and that's what I want to talk about now. And those two factors are climate change and what the Pentagon calls great power competition. So I'm sure I don't have to tell you that climate change is having an enormous impact on the global environment. This summer, all of us in the Northern Hemisphere have experienced wildfires, immense wildfires, and resulting smoke, which we've experienced here in Massachusetts. Heat waves around the world, still persisting and likely to persist into August. Floods. We've had flooding in our neighboring state here of Vermont. Roads have been washed away and communities have been isolated because of bridges wiped out. It's been much worse in places like India and elsewhere, but we've all experienced climate change. But in the earlier period, around 2000, 2005, we didn't factor that into the equation. But now we have to factor climate change into the resource equation. These consequences are myriad, but include among them, first, increased scarcity of fresh water. This is the one resource where scarcity remains a significant factor in world affairs, and where climate change is a powerful factor, because climate change is drying up many areas of that sustain agricultural populations, where the future of those populations is at great risk. We see this especially in the Sahel region and in Asia, where people are dependent on water from the Himalayan glaciers. In the Sahel region of Africa, the Sahara Desert is drying out because of climate change, forcing migratory populations, cattle herders to move south into areas populated by agriculturalists. The migratory peoples are mostly Muslim and Arab. They're encountering peoples who are mainly Christian and Black Africans, often producing conflict and skirmishes and fighting, described as ethnic conflict in the media, but driven in large part by water scarcity. When governments fail to take adequate action, we look at Lake Chad and its consequences. It's drying up of Lake Chad, producing extreme hardship for farmers in a 5-state area of Central Africa, including Nigeria and Chad, of course. When governments don't step in an adequate and equitable fashion, it's led to increasing violence among ethnic groups, and that seems to be increasing. This in turn has led to mass migrations from these areas of conflict and water scarcity into other parts of the country, into the cities, and internationally. And these migrations, as you all know, have led to political disruption, violence, and antagonism wherever they've occurred. A second impact is an accelerated drive by governments to promote the transition to renewable sources of energy to address the climate change impact, especially wind and solar and electric vehicles. We see this through government subsidies and loans to industries to speed the introduction of renewable energy, through incentives to consumers to buy electric vehicles, through requirements for society to increase the renewable share of their energy consumption and to reduce their emissions of carbon dioxide by any means. And this in turn has it boosted the demand for the materials needed for all of this. And people don't seem to understand that renewable sources of energy are not entirely renewable because they require large amounts of scarce specialty minerals like cobalt and lithium and rare earth elements, especially for electric batteries used in electric vehicles, and also for wind turbines and solar panels. These are not renewable materials, and they're not widely distributed on the planet, and they are and there's a need for a sharp increase in their production. So you have, as a consequence, a drive by states, a competitive drive by states to gain control over these sources of strategic materials. Another impact of climate change that we have to think about is heat and its impact on people. And it's clear that we're going to need a vast, mammoth increase in air conditioning. Without it, people are going to die first in the millions, and then in the tens of millions, and then in the hundreds of millions. In Africa and in the Middle East, wherever people have to be outdoors, working during the day where the temperature is over 110 degrees or higher when you add humidity, or if they live in homes that are not air conditioned. Now, who's going to pay for these air conditioners? It's unclear. And where is the electricity going to come from for the air conditioners? That's unclear too. So this has political implications because who will the people in the wealthy north, the wealthy people in the wealthy north, pay for air conditioning and electricity for people in the global south and the poor people in their own country? There are people dying in the United States, in Phoenix, Arizona, where it's been over 110 degrees for days on end now, and because they don't have air conditioning or they have to work outside during the day. This is an equity issue that's going to come to dominate us. And finally, before I wrap up my presentation, the other major consequence of climate change is the opening of the Arctic. The Arctic region was inaccessible mostly until now because it was covered with ice. But as a result of climate change, the Arctic ice cap is melting very rapidly. And in summer, it's it's increasingly clear and may soon be clear all summer long. This allows for resource extraction in the Arctic. And it turns out that the Arctic region is very resource rich. It's estimated to possess up to 30% of the world's remaining natural gas, and perhaps 13% of the world's remaining oil. And so this is still a valuable resource. But more importantly, Greenland is thought to be very rich in the minerals needed for the transition to renewable energy, rare earths, especially rare earth elements, but also uranium and many other minerals. So there is a race now to exploit the resources of the Arctic, which previously was ignored. And this has exacerbated territorial disputes between Russia and its neighbors in particular, and led to the militarization of the Arctic. And it's very possible that the Arctic will become the future site of conflict among the major powers over control of these vital resources that have now become accessible. Let me try to, I should probably wind up, but I wanted to say that there is another dimension to this that we must not ignore. And that's the rise of great power competition as the defining theme in relations among the major powers, especially the US, Russia, and China. From the US military perspective, competition with China is the defining factor in world affairs today. And it defines everything, including resources. And we see this, for example, in the competition over the Arctic and in the securitization of the pursuit of strategic raw materials, strategic minerals needed for the green transition. The US government, the Biden administration, has said that making the green transition is essential to US national security, and that it must have a secure supply chain to do so in competition with China. China is the key player in this field because it's the source of many of those strategic minerals. So now, as a matter of great power competition in geopolitics, the US is going to be organizing to fight China for control over the global supply chain in lithium, cobalt, and rare earth elements. And this is going to result in conflicts, competition, and eventually, I fear, conflict between the US and China in Africa or elsewhere, or the Arctic, over access to these supplies. So I will finish by making some concluding thoughts. What I've learned from all of this, first of all, we have to be very careful about predicting scarcities, because technology often is able to come up with new methods of extracting minerals and oil and natural gas from the earth that surprise us. So as long as profit is to be made from the sale of oil and gas and other fossil fuels, companies will find ways to increase their supply. And that's what's happened over the past 20 years. The notion of peak oil has vanished. We've also seen the rapid development of what are called renewables. But we have to be very, very careful about this notion and recognize that renewable energy supplies often involve reliance on non-renewable supplies of minerals. And so our goal in the end, I believe, has to be transition without war. Energy transition without war. And that means when we move towards renewable sources of energy, we have to look for that to be based on a complete, from beginning to end, renewable sources, or reliance on components that are not scarce. So the current path of EVs to rely on lithium and cobalt-based energy is not a path towards renewability. It's a path towards conflict. So we have to look to alternatives. If we want to go down the path of EVs, we need to be looking at alternatives to lithium cobalt-based batteries and for other sources. And we need to promote alternatives to vehicles altogether, bicycles, train, buses, every way possible. And my final comment is that competition between US and China is destined to lead us, if not to World War III, to a period of intense global competition, tension, friction, and a failure to overcome the issues I've described. So cooperation between US and China, and eventually India, on addressing climate change and these resource issues is the only path to a just and safe human future. So I'll stop there.
Many thanks, Michael, for this sobering analysis of the limits to the script by the current green energy and advanced technology movements. Thanks also for your insights on what might work as alternatives, harken back to your interest in architecture and the need to reconstruct space and reflect on time. As you point out in your analysis, the ecological modernization of technological optimists, in fact, creates more conflicts. But as central to your account of resource wars and great power competition is the notion of scarcity. To what extent do emerging technologies eliminate or at least reduce the scarce resource problem?
So Franklin, as I see it, technology has the capacity to eliminate scarcity. But what I've learned is that technology development is expensive, and it is mostly controlled by giant corporations. Some of these are entirely private, like Microsoft and Google. Some of them are state-owned or partially state-owned, like the big corporations in China. But mostly they're giant corporations. And these corporations are driven not by love of humanity, but by love of profit. And they will develop these technologies, but they have to have a return on their investment. And therefore, they will use the technologies in ways that generate profit. And that means essentially providing them, supplying them to people who could pay for them. And this means the wealthier people in the wealthier parts of the world. Will they be able, so there will be technology, but the question is, will it be equitably made available to those in need? And I have huge doubts about that in the current world's environment. I mentioned air conditioning. Air conditioning is not a complicated technology, but it's the difference between life and death right now in many parts of the world. People are dying in Europe because they do not have air conditioners in their home, especially elderly people. I fall into that category myself, so I'm sympathetic. I possess air conditioning. You could see it behind my head. An advanced air conditioning. But who's going? So the question is, will the state, will governments provide these free to people in need?
Right.
That is the question between life and death. And I don't have optimism. So it's not the problem. It's not a problem of technology. It is a problem of equity.
Talking about the problem of equity, you suggest then that it is the monopolization of technology that is the problem. Well, the Ukrainian leaders continue to ask for, and Western leaders continue to supply more sophisticated technologies for resistance and peace, a practice which is widely supported around the world. In other words, there's some attempt to share these technologies. So I have to ask you this. What is the place of emerging technologies in the march for peace?
The role of emerging technologies in the road to peace?
In the road to peace.
I don't see that right now, Franklin. I'm sorry. Right now, emerging technologies are largely being harnessed by the military forces of the world to make war. So I don't see how they contribute to peace.
That is very clear, Michael. In your analysis of war and peace, what do you think is the one move that will end the war by Russia and bring peace to Ukraine?
I think there's not one move, but several. And I hope this comes as soon as possible to end the suffering of people in Ukraine. And for that matter, the people in Russia who suffer, especially the soldiers. What I think it's going to take is the offering of both constraints and incentives to the competing parties, especially Russia. I think that Vladimir Putin has trapped himself in this war. I think he went into it with severe miscalculations about the likelihood of success. He clearly believed that this would be an overnight victory for Russia and would enhance his popularity at home. That was a severe error. Now, if he were to withdraw, it would be a severe blow to his prestige and maybe to his presidency, to his regime, maybe to his life. So he's sort of trapped in the quagmire of his own making. And so somebody has to pull him out of that. And I think the way for that to happen is for a group of countries, maybe China, India, and Turkey, and others, to say to Putin, well, if you stop the war and withdraw from the conquered territories, we will help you restore your economy and help bring you back into the world of nations and bring Moscow back into the international spotlight. That's what I think it's going to take.
Thank you for these insightful responses, Michael. I will now open the floor for questions